At Sunday dinner, my mom casually announced has updated his will. Everything would go to my brother since he'd actually done something with his life. My dad nodded. I just grinned, finished my plate, and left. I, 32 just found out my parents wrote me out of their will at Sunday dinner. They have no idea what's coming. Let me start from the beginning. I had been dreading Sunday dinners for months, but this one would be different. As I sat at the familiar oak table where I'd eaten thousands of meals growing up, I couldn't have predicted that my mother would casually destroy what was left of our relationship between the main course and dessert. She was cutting into her roast beef when she mentioned it, as if she were commenting on the weather. Dad had updated his will, she said, and everything would be going to my brother since he'd actually done something with his life. Dad just nodded along. Chewing his food like this wasn't a complete betrayal of his younger son. I kept eating, took another bite of mashed potatoes, asked for the salt. Inside, something cold and calculating clicked into place. See, my parents had no idea what I'd actually been doing for the past 3 years. While they fawned over my brother's middle management position at some corporate firm, I'd been quietly building something they couldn't even comprehend. But their dismissal of me wasn't new. It had been going on since we were kids. My brother had always been the golden child. Star athlete in high school, decent grades, went to the state university they could brag about to their friends. Me? I was the quiet one who spent too much time on computers, who didn't play sports, who went to community college first because my grades weren't perfect. In their eyes, I was the disappointment. What they didn't know was that I'd been accepted to MIT after community college. Full scholarship. I just never told them because I was tired of their surprise when I accomplished anything. I'd graduated with a degree in computer science and had been working remotely for a tech startup that had just been acquired by a major corporation for $40 million. My equity stake was about to make me very, very comfortable. But that night at dinner, listening to my mother explain how my brother deserved everything because he'd made something of himself, while I was apparently still the family failure, I realized something important. I was done trying to prove myself to them. I was done caring about their approval. I finished my plate, thanked them for dinner, and left. They probably thought I was upset about the will. They had no idea I was already 3 steps ahead. The acquisition closed the following Tuesday. My lawyer called to confirm the wire transfer had gone through. $7.2 million after taxes. I stared at my bank balance for a long time, then started making calls. The first call was to a real estate agent. My parents' neighborhood had been gentrifying rapidly, and their house, the house I'd grown up in, sat on a corner lot that developers had been eyeing for months. I'd been tracking the property values obsessively since dinner on Sunday. 3 houses on their street had sold in the past 6 months, all to the same development company. I scheduled a meeting for Thursday. Wednesday night, I drove by their house. Dad was in the garage working on his old Camaro, the same car he'd been restoring for 15 years. Mom's garden looked perfect as always, every flower in place. They looked so settled, so sure of their little world. Thursday morning, I met with the development company's acquisitions team. I explained that I was interested in purchasing several properties in my parents' neighborhood for development purposes. Did they have any they couldn't close on? Any stubborn holdouts? They showed me a map. My parents' house was marked in red. The family refuses to sell, the project manager explained. They'd made offers, but the homeowners weren't interested. It was holding up a $12 million mixed-use development. I studied the map like I was seeing it for the first time. Asked about the property values, the development timeline, their target acquisition price. I took notes, asked smart questions, played the part of a serious investor. Then I made them an offer they couldn't refuse. I would purchase the entire development project, all the land they'd already acquired, plus I'd handle getting the remaining holdout properties, including the corner lot. $15 million, cash, with closing in 30 days. They thought I was insane until my lawyer sent over proof of funds. The weekend before closing, I drove by the house again. Mom was hosting her book club, the same group of women she'd been meeting with for 20 years. Dad was washing his car in the driveway. Everything looked exactly the same as it had when I was growing up. I parked across the street and called them. Dad answered, and I told him I needed to talk to both of them. Something important had come up. Could I come over? I walked into that house for what I knew would be the last time as their son's home. They were sitting in the living room, Mom looking concerned, Dad looking impatient. He'd been planning to catch the game. I sat down across from them and explained that I had some news about their property. There was going to be a development in their neighborhood, I said. The company had been buying up houses, and they'd be receiving an offer soon. Mom immediately started talking about how they'd never sell, how this was their home, how they'd raised their family here. Dad nodded along, saying they weren't interested in any amount of money. I told them I understood completely. Then I explained that the development company had already acquired every other property on their block. Theirs was the last holdout. The company was prepared to go to court if necessary, to use eminent domain if they could make the case for public benefit. The look on their faces was everything I'd hoped for and more. But then I offered them a way out. I'd heard about their situation through my work. I'd been doing consulting for development companies, I explained, which wasn't entirely untrue. I could potentially help them negotiate a better deal, maybe even find them a comparable house in a nearby neighborhood. For the next hour, I watched my parents transform from confident homeowners to worried retirees facing an uncertain future. I offered to make some calls to see what I could do. They were so grateful. I spent the weekend playing the part perfectly, called them with updates about my negotiations with the development company, told them the company was being aggressive, but I thought I could work something out. Monday morning, my lawyer delivered the official purchase offer. Fair market value plus 20%. Enough that they couldn't claim it was lowball, but not enough to make them rich. The letter explained that this was a final offer, and if they declined, the company would begin the legal process to acquire the property through other means. They called me in a panic. I rushed over to find them sitting at the same kitchen table where they'd casually announced I was worth nothing just 2 weeks earlier. I reviewed the offer with them, playing the concerned son who just wanted to help his parents. The price was actually quite good, I explained. And given the legal alternatives, it might be their best option. But here's where it got interesting. I told them I'd been thinking about their situation all weekend, and I had an idea. What if I bought the house from them myself? I'd recently come into some money. A consulting contract had paid better than expected, and I could offer them the same price as the development company. That way, they'd know the house was staying in the family, and they could even visit anytime they wanted. The relief on their faces was beautiful. Dad actually teared up talking about how proud he was that I'd stepped up to help them. Mom hugged me for the first time in years. We closed the following Friday. My parents moved into a nice rental house across town. Temporary, they thought, while they looked for something to buy. I was covering their rent until they figured out their next step, I told them. It was the least I could do. That evening, I stood in the empty house where I'd grown up. Every room held memories, but they felt distant now, like they belonged to someone else. I walked through each space methodically, saying goodbye to the version of myself who desperately wanted these people's approval. The demolition started the following Monday. Update 1. The development moved faster than anyone expected. By the time my parents realized what was happening, their childhood home was already gone. They drove by after hearing the noise and found a pile of rubble where their kitchen table used to be. Mom called me crying. How could I have let this happen? Why didn't I stop it? I explained patiently that I'd bought the house to save it, but the development company had made me an offer I couldn't refuse. The profit would help me get established in my career. Surely they could understand that. Dad got on the phone and started yelling about family loyalty, about how I'd betrayed them. I listened to every word, then calmly reminded him about our last Sunday dinner together, about how they decided I'd never amount to anything, about how my brother deserved everything because he'd actually done something with his life. The silence stretched for a long time. I told them their rent was paid through the end of the month, but after that, they'd need to make other arrangements. I had my own life to worry about now. Update 2. 6 months later, my brother called me for the first time since Christmas. He'd heard about what happened with the house, and he wanted to know if the family could work things out. Mom and Dad were struggling financially, he said. Their retirement savings weren't stretching as far as they'd expected, and they were worried about the future. I met him for coffee at a place downtown, far from anywhere our parents might go. He looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his cup and avoiding eye contact. Eventually, he admitted that they'd all underestimated me. They hadn't realized I was doing so well, and they felt bad about how things had gone. I asked him if he remembered growing up. Did he remember how every one of my achievements was minimized while his were celebrated? Did he remember Mom introducing me to her friends as our other son, while describing him as our successful one? Did he remember Dad missing every single academic award ceremony I had because they conflicted with his sporting events? He remembered. He just hadn't thought it mattered that much. I told him about MIT, about the scholarship they'd never bothered to ask about the startup and the acquisition and the money they'd never imagined I could earn. I told him about the 3 years I'd spent building something real while they dismissed me as a failure. His face went white when I explained exactly how much money I'd made from the development deal. Not just from selling them the house, but from the entire project. The corner lot had been the key piece that made the whole development viable. Without it, the company would have lost millions. I own $12 million worth of real estate now. The mixed-use development would generate rental income for decades. I'd used their dismissal of me to fuel the most profitable business decision of my life. But the money wasn't the point, I told him. The point was that they'd had a son who loved them, who wanted their approval, who would have shared his success with them. Instead, they'd chosen to believe I was worthless right up until the moment it cost them everything. He asked what it would take to fix this. What did I want from them? I wanted them to understand that actions have consequences. I wanted them to realize that the son they'd written off had been worth more than they'd ever imagined. And I wanted them to live with the knowledge that their own prejudice had cost them the security they'd spent 40 years building. He left the coffee shop shaking his head, muttering about how this wasn't the brother he'd grown up with. He was right. That brother had died at a Sunday dinner 6 months ago. Update 3. A year later, I got a letter from Mom. Not an email, not a text, but an actual handwritten letter delivered to my new address. She must have hired someone to find me, because I'd moved across the country after the development finished. The letter was 12 pages long. She wrote about her childhood, about her own parents' expectations, about how she'd learned to measure success in ways that made sense to her generation. She wrote about being proud of my brother because his path was familiar, because she understood what his achievements meant. She wrote about being afraid of my intelligence, about not knowing how to support interests she couldn't comprehend. She wrote about assuming I'd find my own way because I'd always been independent, not realizing that independence was something I'd learned because I had to. She apologized. Not for the will, she barely mentioned that, but for making me feel invisible in my own family, for celebrating my brother's mediocrity while ignoring my excellence, for choosing comfort over curiosity when it came to understanding who I'd become. The last page was about regret, about lying awake wondering who I might have been if they'd supported me the way they'd supported him, about realizing too late that they'd raised 2 sons, but only ever really knew one. I read that letter 3 times, then put it in my desk drawer. I never wrote back. 2 months ago, I got married. Small ceremony, just close friends and my wife's family. We bought a house in the mountains, somewhere quiet where I can work remotely and she can paint. It's the kind of life I used to dream about during those lonely Sunday dinners. My brother sent a wedding card. Inside, he'd written that he hoped someday we could be family again, that our parents were proud of what I'd accomplished, even if they'd never figured out how to say it. I appreciate the sentiment, but he still doesn't understand. This was never about getting them to finally recognize my worth. This was about learning that I didn't need their recognition to have worth. The development is finished now. Luxury condos and retail space where my childhood home used to stand. Sometimes I drive by when I'm in town visiting my wife's family. It looks nothing like the neighborhood where I grew up, but that's probably for the best. I heard my parents had to move in with my brother last year. Their rental situation became untenable, and their savings ran out faster than expected. I'm sure it's cramped, having 3 adults in his 2-bedroom apartment. I'm sure there are tensions about money and space and the future. I'm sure they think about that Sunday dinner sometimes, about the son who smiled and finished his plate and walked away from them forever. I hope they understand now that success isn't just about the path you choose. It's about the person you become when no one believes you can walk it. I don't hate them anymore. Hate requires too much energy, and I have better things to focus on now. But I don't love them either. Love requires trust, and they taught me that trust is something you earn, not something you inherit. They made their choice that Sunday evening. They chose to see me as a disappointment, as the son who'd never amount to anything, as someone whose feelings didn't matter as much as their golden child's ego. I made my choice too. I chose to prove them right about one thing. I really was different from the son they thought they knew. I was smarter, more determined, and far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. The best part? They'll never know if I did this out of calculated revenge or if it was just business. They'll never be sure if I planned their downfall from that moment at the dinner table, or if I simply took advantage of an opportunity that presented itself. The truth is, it doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm free now. free from their expectations, their disappointment, their conditional love, free to build something meaningful with someone who chose to see my worth from the beginning. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. Sometimes it's simply becoming so successful that their opinion becomes irrelevant. Sometimes it's walking away and never looking back, leaving them to wonder what they lost and whether it was worth it. I know the answer to that question, but they'll have to figure it out for themselves.